Hello. So for my final presentation, I decided to focus on the differences of drinking across cultures, which was a pretty big topic to tackle, especially because it's so broad depending on the culture. So I decided to specifically look at American culture, primarily because it's most dominant research that I could find, and Italian cultures. Um, so to kind of start off, I wanted to think about the first time that like someone drank alcohol. For me, it was at a fairly young age. I was introduced to it fairly young, which I don't think often happens in a lot of American families. Um, but I was thinking about it, and I was like, think about the first time you took a sip of it. For a lot of people, it's as a child, maybe on a holiday, a family offered them a sip of wine or something, or maybe it was at a party in high school, drinking cheap vodka that a friend's brother bought for someone. Either way, Americans have a specific perception of alcohol, and I wanted to compare and contrast that with that of another culture, specifically Italian, because I've always been very interested in how different Europeans are with their way of drinking. So first, we'll start off by looking at Americans' drinking habits and how that impacts their kind of sense of identity and interactional goals. My presentation will mostly focus on face management and rapport management and how drinking can impact that depending on each culture. For Americans, they really love to drink. While the legal drinking age is 21, according to the CDC, people aged 12 to 20 years old drink 11% of all alcohol consumed in the United States. The CDC also says that more than 90% of this alcohol is consumed in the form of binge drinking. Binge drinking is really frequent among Americans, and the CDC also tells us that 1 in 6 US adults binge drink about 4 times a month, consuming about 7 drinks per binge. In total, this results in about 17 billion total binge drinks consumed by adults annually, or 467 binge drinks per binge drinker. And predominantly, this is common among young people aged 18 to 34 years old. So, in finding this research, I looked at the fact that young people predominantly have it as a social aspect, and since this is a communication class, I wanted to look at how that ties in together. So I will mostly be focusing on young people, particularly in an American context, underage drinkers. And we'll go back to a little bit how that doesn't impact Italians as much, since their drinking age is technically 16. Back to American culture, though, there's obviously very many risks to drinking, and in America, we see those a lot more frequently with underage drinking, especially, obviously, when it comes to alcohol-related crashes, disruption of normal growth and development among individuals, and higher risks of suicide or memory problems. And at least like when I see drinking in our culture in America, it's often seen as an act of a rebellion, especially since the drinking age is significantly higher than a lot of other countries at 21. And since we have such a high party culture in America, I think that that really connects to this sense of identity and forming that idea of oneself in such a young age. So in doing this research, I saw that individuals particularly have this relationship with themselves, but also self and relationship to others. And in an effort to save face among their peers, individuals who are typically underage drinkers will feel pressured to drink, ultimately, specifically drinking high quantities of alcohol and binge drinking in order to impress others and uphold a reputation and manage face. That being said, though, Italians, on the other hand, have a very different outlook of drinking. And this can directly be linked to the fact that their drinking is introduced at a very young age. It's more of a culturally traditional thing to drink at the dinner table, be given a glass of wine. And this aims to kind of introduce children and adolescents to alcohol to ultimately have them respect it more as a culturally traditional thing rather than an act of rebellion like we do in America. So let's look at how they interpret their drinking and how it interacts with the world around them and their peers. So like I said, in Italy, similar to other European cultures, it's a culturally traditional thing to drink and pass it on through generation, introducing it to children early on in their life. However, according to a research report that I found in the Sage journals, daily consumption at home and at mealtime seems to be restricted to relatively few groups of people, typically male youth, mainly in the middle and lower class homes. So we don't see it as much in other groups like young females or even in higher up people in society or class structures. But it's still pretty common that at the dinner table, in kind of overall, that an individual in Italy will be given a drink, which we do not see here in America. And so, since technically the drinking age is 16, the laws around drinking are really loose in Italy, and I think there's a kind of a gap in the research on how that affects underage drinking, because technically minors who are under 18 can't buy their own alcohol, but it still happens somehow, and the laws around it are very loose. But that also leads to the fact that there's not as many issues with underage drinking in Italy as there is in the US. According to a study I found done by a researcher at the Boston University School of Public Health, Italian youths whose parents allowed them to have alcohol with meals while they were growing up are less likely to develop harmful drinking patterns in the future. Since the researcher did the study in Italy, it kind of obviously looks more at their culture and European culture in general. But he said that the results could assist in the design of policies to reduce alcohol problems and harmful behavior among young people in different countries and parts of the world. And just to conclude on Italian drinking culture, it's such an accepted part of society, so it's therefore ingrained in the norms of the culture, and it kind of helps someone form their sense of identity from a very young age and its role in their family dynamic. Therefore, there's not this sense of worrying about it being more of like a popularity thing as you see in the transition to adulthood in American culture. So that's just kind of a brief overview of each culture's attitude toward drinking. So I kind of want to analyze more why these differences exist, just to conclude. To me, I think that drinking is kind of like a forbidden fruit to individuals in America, since they have to wait until 21 to drink legally. But that leads to the high risk of underage drinking, which we know exists, specifically binge drinking, and a multitude of health and safety risks. Since drinking in Italy is introduced in the form of a glass of wine during a meal, it is seen as a tradition passed on to generation. So it's significantly different from America's ideal of it and their cultural and societal norms around it. Young Americans in general are always concerned with face management and how they're going to be perceived by the public or the people around them. So I think that connects to why underage drinking is so rampant here. We're worried more about our self-identity and formulating like how we're going to be perceived by our peers and our friends, and drug and alcohol use is predominant in that. The average American drinks 13.7 liters of alcohol per year, which isn't too far off from Italy's, which is 12 liters. However, this study doesn't focus on the amount of alcohol that's consumed. It's more about the culture around drinking in general and the scope of like how each culture interacts with alcohol. And since America does so in a different way culturally and kind of peer-to-peer, I think that contributes to the reason there's more underage and binge drinking, and how Italians, in a sense, have more respect for it. Ultimately, just starting that idea of alcohol being forbidden to Americans from a very young age, and it leading to how they're going to interact with it the rest of their lives, whereas Italians don't face that risk. Just some few takeaways. I think it's important to note that Europeans have a radically different view than us, and obviously this is kind of just a general Americanized overlook at the research. But the times are also changing too, so that's important to take note of, and that it's hard to tell if these things will hold true for the future. According to a study in Live Science, wine consumption has actually declined rapidly in Italy in the past several years, so that has contributed to the decline in alcoholism at all that exists there, and alcohol-related deaths. So now Italy has an extremely low rate compared to the US, according to the World Health Organization's latest report on alcohol and health. That same report also found that the estimated prevalence of alcohol in Italy in people ages 15 and over was only 1% in the year of 2010, but that percentage was 7.4% in the United States for the same year. So it's pretty easy to see that drinking is kind of a rapidly different issue in each country, in each culture in general, cultural difference in general. And I think it's interesting to see how countries like Italy have more of a liberal outlook on it, bring it into an individual's life much sooner than America, therefore resulting in a safer association with drinking. And as an American, like I said in the beginning, that is introduced to alcohol at a very young age, I think it made me aware of the risks of it a lot more than a lot of Americans, therefore giving me a better idea of how to incorporate it in my own life in more of a safe and responsible way. And I think America could benefit from looking at countries like Italy and how they approach drinking. And another quote I found from a Sage Journal study was, youth in these cultures learn to drink more responsibly than their U.S. counterparts in Italy because drinking is culturally normative. Exposure occurs at a younger age, and alcohol is part of the fabric of family mores. So that kind of is where I wanted to leave it, concluding with that, just to see that an individual's adolescence is extremely impacted by the people around them and how they interact with one another. And since drinking is socially acceptable and allowed in Italy at such a young age, that impacts how they're going to do it in a setting versus how America is with their underage drinkers and even young adolescent drinkers who are legal. Thank you.